The moment I had signed the sales contract for the old farmhouse, I'd been happier than I was in years. You see, in life, I did everything right. I heeded the advice of my teachers and parents. After I had finished school, I went on to university and got my degree in business. I graduated with honors and started working at a fancy company. After a decade and a half, I'd climbed high enough on the corporate ladder to be head of the sales department, and it meant quite the salary, but also more responsibility and more hours on the job. During these years, I moved into a newer, fancier place about every couple of years, bought more luxuries, but spent less and less time at home enjoying it all. With each passing year, I grew to hate my life a bit more. I hated my job, my apartment, and even the overcrowded city that I lived in. I was yearning for a break and for some quiet and solitude. When my Uncle Dennis died, I was surprised to be named the sole benefactor. Apparently, he had no other relatives besides me, and selling most of his property left me with a substantial sum. With the savings I already had, I decided it was time for a change. I had long dabbled with the idea of moving to a rural area, growing my own vegetables, get a few chickens, live kind of a self-sustaining lifestyle far away from the big city really sounded nice. It had always been something I was interested in, sort of a fantasy. Reality was different. There were deadlines to make, projects to finish, and contracts to discuss and sing. Time moved along, and year after year I did nothing. Now, though, enough was enough. I didn't want to end up like the people who'd finally made it to retirement, only to realize that they were now too old and feeble to follow their dreams. When I quit my job, my boss was surprised and flabbergasted. Of course, I still had my termination period of 4 weeks, but most of that time was spent to make adjustments. While my boss was busy finding a replacement for me, I started to look around for a promising property. After a week of searching, I found it. It was an old farmhouse that had quite a few plots around it. It was located in a small village near a mountainous area. Until about 2 years ago, it had been owned by a woman, but after she died, her son had put it up for sale. When I visited the place, I saw that it was old, and not just a bit run down. But I was sure all this could be fixed. My last day at work arrived quickly. It was a few weeks later that I finally signed the sales contract and started to move what few belongings I wanted to keep to the old farmhouse. Once I'd put together some sort of temporary living quarters, I decided it was time to move in. I tried my hands at remodeling the old house myself, but I was soon reminded that I never had any talent with my hands. In the end, I gave up in frustration and contacted a company for it. It took another couple of weeks, but once they were done, the place looked nice, cozy, and modern. After the repairs on the chicken coop were finished, I bought half a dozen chickens and a rooster. Being awoken by him in the morning reminded me of those childhood days I spent at my grandparents' farm. The nostalgia flooded over me in pleasant ways as I drank my morning coffee. By now, I decided it was time to visit what few neighbors I had. To the north of me, quite a bit away, lived an older lady, and next to her, a middle-aged couple whose kids went to middle school. After my initial introductions, I didn't really have much to do with them. To the south lived an older couple, the Richards. They lived in a huge old farmhouse. They used to be farmers themselves when they were younger, but had since retired. They were nice and assured me they'd help me out if I ever had any problems. And after that, there was only one person left. The old man living to the farm to the east of me. It was an old farmer who I guess was in his late 50s, early 60s. He owned the fields adjacent to mine. Only a small dirt road divided our properties. I'd seen him from afar a few times, but whenever I greeted him, he ignored me. His face was hard as if carved from stone, his lips were always pressed together, and he had a perpetually angry expression. The moment I walked over towards his farm, he tried his best to ignore me yet again. When he saw that I walked towards him, he turned to me. His face showed that he'd rather do anything else but talk to me. "Hello, I'm Daniel. I bought the..."
Know damn well who you are. You're the guy who bought Lisbeth's old house. Made it all fancy and whatnot.
Yeah, nice to meet you." With that, I held out my hand for a greeting. He didn't budge or even look at my hand, and I was awkwardly holding it out in the empty air between us.
Why'd you move here?
"Oh, I was going to try my luck at farming. I always wanted to grow my own." I broke up as the old man burst into laughter.
You? Farming? Your hands are as soft as a girl's. This land is tough. I'll tell you right away that you won't grow a damn thing here. We don't need city folks around here. Ha!
With that, he spat on the ground in front of me and without another word, made his way towards the shack. For a while I stood there, looking at the old guy. I was nothing short of surprised and kind of dumbfounded. Why'd he throw so much hate at me? What the hell was his problem? More than a bit mad, I went back home. What had I done to get that type of reaction? In the end, I told myself he was most likely just a miserable old fool who hated himself and people in general. Not my problem. From that point onward, I tried my best to get my farm going. My knowledge was limited, though minimal. The internet, with its endless information, is fantastic, but it was secondhand knowledge. I soon realized that if I ever wanted to learn how to do anything, I'd have to get my own hands dirty. I started with the little old lady's small garden and planted a variety of different vegetables. The month after that, I got the old greenhouse running again. I soon had to learn the real life was no harvest moon. Running a farm and growing vegetables was tough. Needless to say, things didn't grow well at all. It was a little later that I was meeting with Hans Richter and his wife that I learned that the ground here wasn't the best anymore. They didn't know what it was, but almost everyone had trouble getting things to grow out here. You need a lot of care and fertilizer if you want it to succeed. A decade ago, a few small-time farmers were still living here. As things got harder, most of them just abandoned the trade. Some turned to raise livestock, others changed to different professions. There was only one single person whose fields were still flourishing. Old Werner's. It turned out that old Werner was no other than my next-door neighbor. When I told the Richters how my introduction with him went, they both started to laugh. Werner was a bitter old man. He didn't like people and had lived alone most of his life. He was a solitary man. When I asked if something happened to him, they both said no. It was just how he was. It'd be best for me just to ignore him. That's what everyone else did anyways. As I'd said, I took things slow. Worked the garden, studied different types of seeds, how to care for crops, and many other topics. It was early summer by then, so much too late to actually sow anything on the fields, so I let them lay fallow for the year. As summer moved along, though, I was surprised to see how the old man's fields were bursting with ripe grain and vegetables. Sure, they told me the old man was doing all right, but I saw it was more than that. No, he seemed to be doing pretty damn well. I could barely get a tomato plant to bear fruit in the greenhouse, yet he had fields of them. Harvest came and went, and I was frustrated at my own inability to have grown anything, but also impressed at how well he was doing. I didn't like it one bit. As summer turned to autumn, there was one thing I found just a bit strange. I often caught the old guy driving out in the middle of the night and returning back home a few hours later. I noticed it by accident when I was out one night. I decided to take a walk in the mild autumn air to gaze at the stars. I was on my way to the local viewing platform when a car approached me from behind. Its headlights were off and it sped past me. Yet I was sure I'd seen old Werner. I didn't think anything of it, yet I wondered why he drove around without his headlights on. My first thought was maybe he forgot them, or hell, he might just be an asshole who liked to scare people. In time I learned that the old man was making these ominous trips frequently, always in the middle of the night and still without his headlights on. There was no other explanation. He was just trying not to get noticed. Well, to be honest, it was none of my business, and I told myself to ignore him and his weird antics. Yet I couldn't help but find it unnerving. I started to wonder what reason he had for this strange nightly trips. It didn't help that he kept it up all autumn and continued well into early winter. It was a sheer mystery to me. Once the new year began and spring came around, I started to do the same as all the other farmers. Started working my fields. I got quite a few stares and scoffs from old Werner. Many snide remarks were directed at me, and I'd seen him laugh his ass off when things didn't work out well for me. To tell you the truth, I tried my very best to stay above his behavior. Every once in a while, though, I couldn't help but yell back something similar. I had a few very long talks with Hans Richter, and he had been paying me the occasional visit. He helped me get things going, advised me on when to sow what fertilizer to use, and so many other important things. I have no clue what I had done without him. He was a godsend. Still, it didn't matter all too much. Things just didn't grow. Each day I walked the fields, looking at the rows upon rows of barren earth. Only here and there a few lonely plants were growing. Old Werner's fields, on the other hand, were thriving. And of course, the old man wasn't shy about rubbing it in.
You city folks just don't have it in you. That's what it is.
He'd shout over at me and start laughing. And other times he was condescendingly being an asshole, pitying me.
That's as far as you'll get. If I were you, I'd just give up while I still could. No reason to keep trying.
I hated that damn old man. One day after I'd watered the few lonely plants that were growing, he came over to pull another one of his nasty jokes.
Shouldn't water them too much. Don't want one of these few plants you accidentally got to grow to go to waste, do you?
How the hell do you do it? I asked instead of reacting to his remark. He just stared at me. How come your crops are growing so well when no one else can do it? And don't give me that city folk bullshit. Everyone here tells me they've got trouble as well. The old man's face started to distort into a knowing grin, yet he said nothing. At that moment, I realized how often I'd seen him walk into the fields with these unnamed bags of fertilizer. Is it the fertilizer of yours?
Huh, not as dumb as you look,
He answered. So what sort of fertilizer is it? Do you make it yourself? What do you put in it? The old man burst out laughing.
You think I'm gonna tell you a damn thing about it? Oh, I don't think so, said, spitting on the ground. This is my very own special formula. You've got no idea what I'm going through to make it, to perfect it. Before I tell anyone, especially you, I'd rather have the devil take me away.
Without another word, he turned around and stormed back to his farm. As the weeks went on, most of my fields would stay barren. The old man's were covered in lush green like they'd been the years before. What the hell was in that fertilizer of his, I wondered? It was something later, when I visited the Richters, that I saw the local newspaper on the kitchen table. I half-heartedly opened it, and an article caught my eye. Middle-aged woman still missing since last autumn. The article was about a woman, a mother of two, who'd gone missing on a hiking trip in a nearby area last year. When I started reading, Susan, Han's wife, came over. Such a sad story. I wonder why it keeps happening. Hold on. What do you mean? Oh, it's these hiking paths near the mountains. Every year people vanish there. The authorities say it's a slippery slopes and people aren't careful enough. Why don't they close it off?
It really is something, her husband said. They always warn hikers and climbers, but people don't listen. A mother of two, what was she even thinking?
I listened to them and learned that more than a dozen people had gone missing near the mountain range. Last year, it hadn't been only the woman, but an older man as well. They said it was almost inevitable that people went missing there. Of course, people talked to the local council, but they didn't listen. The normal hiking paths and climbing locations were safe and secure, and there were enough warnings about straying from them. As I listened to them, there was something in the back of my mind, something that I couldn't quite grasp. Only when I returned home and saw old Werner stalking around his fields did I remember what it was. The woman had gone missing in autumn. Wasn't that the time when he went on one of those trips? I realized what my brain was trying to put together. The more I thought about it, the more everything did fit together. He drove out in the middle of the night, headlights off, to an unknown location, and there was this special fertilizer of his. For a moment, I couldn't help but imagine old Werner out on the hiking paths at night searching for lonely wanderers to turn them into fertilizer. What was I thinking? I almost burst out laughing at my own ridiculous idea. This was not a movie, this was real life. Somehow, though, I couldn't completely get rid of the idea. I don't know why I did it, but I started to spy on the old man. It might have been my frustration, it might have been boredom, it might have even been the resentment I felt towards him, I'm not sure. It was not that I believed in my idea. It was way too far-fetched. I told myself that all I wanted was to just figure out how he grew his crops and what sort of fertilizer he used. I knew I was only lying to myself, though. Now, I thought there was more about this old fool, his strange behavior, and that fertilizer of his. The more I thought about it, the more I was able to convince myself. Whenever I saw him out in the fields applying his fertilizer, my thoughts went back to the same topic. I told myself to stop, leave it alone. But I couldn't. It wasn't long before my curiosity turned into an obsession, and I started to take tabs on him. I took notes on how often he went out, when he got up in the morning, how long he stayed up in the evening, and many other things. It wasn't like I really had much to do else anyways. Most of my fields resembled a barren wasteland. After a couple of weeks, I had his whole routine written down. I knew pretty much everything that went on at his farm. So I was more than a bit surprised when I saw him drive out with his car in the middle of the night on Saturday. He hadn't done that in the past 5 weeks. It was by sheer coincidence that I even noticed it. It was already early morning when he returned. I saw him get out of his car, but instead of going back inside, he went to the back of the car and opened the trunk. In the dark of night, hunched behind my window, I pressed my binoculars against my head so hard it hurt. My whole body tensed up and I didn't dare move or breathe. In horror, I watched the old Werner drag something out of his trunk. It was long, big, and covered in a thick blanket. I watched as he heaved it over his shoulder. As he took his first step, I saw something long and thin dangle from the pack. Oh, Jesus Christ, I thought. Don't tell me. Was that what I thought it was? Had I seen it? Nah, I must be wrong. I was seeing things. Maybe I'd imagined it. What I'd seen dangling, it couldn't be. I thought back to the woman in the newspaper article. Was this another one? Another victim? Another ingredient for his fertilizer? I had to go there and find out more. I should take a look at that shack. The moment I saw old Werner return from his shack, all thoughts about going there left my mind. It was dark, but in the moonlight I could clearly see that his hands and lower arms were covered in something. I saw his dark and angry expression as he made his way back into his house. My whole body was filled with fear. For the first time in my entire life, I was honestly and utterly terrified. I couldn't help the urge to hide as soon as he'd walk back to his house. I knew there was no reason for it. The old guy couldn't possibly see me. I had my lights off, and I was way too far away for him to notice anything at the windows. And once he'd vanished inside, I started to calm down. At least a bit. My mind was still going like a crazed whirlwind of contradicting ideas. One part of it said that I was stupid and nothing was going on. The other part told me old Werner was a crazed serial killer. Even in bed, I couldn't calm down, and it took me a long time till I actually fell asleep. When the rooster awoke me in the morning, I was thankful the few hours of sleep I'd had were undisturbed and free from dreams about bloodied old men. While I was drinking my morning coffee, I watched his house as I'd done every morning for the past weeks. As if nothing had happened last night. The old man went out to take care of his fields. Had this guy really murdered someone last night and then dragged their body back into his shack? As I sat there, I was almost shaking with curiosity. I had to find out. I had to. I knew that every week on Sunday evening, he spent an hour or two at his shack. During that time, he most likely mixed up his fertilizer. Once he was done, he went back to his house and most likely straight to bed. So this might be my best chance to see what he's up to in there. The whole day I was antsy and I couldn't sit still. I made plans of what I'd do, how I'd approach, and how I'd find the bloody body lying there on the floor of the shack. When the day finally turned to night, I turned off the lights in my house to give him the impression I went to bed early. He'd believe it, I was sure.
Us city folks don't work as hard as he did.
As most likely what he would have thought in his arrogance. All the while, I sat at my window watching him with my binoculars. My cue was when the lights of the shack turned off, and the old man went back into his house. I dressed in all black, and after waiting for another half an hour, I made my way outside. With low and quiet steps, I made my way over to his place. For the first time, I wasn't mad at how well his corn had grown. It allowed me to get near his house without having to hide too much. Once I was closer, I checked out his farm from beneath the corn. The lights were off. There were no sounds and nothing was moving. It was clear that the old man must have gone to bed. To be on the safe side, I still waited for another 10 minutes. When they passed, I rushed to his shack. My heart was beating heavy when I made it, and everything stayed quiet. I wasn't too surprised to find the door was locked by a padlock. Even I knew that there was no way I'd be able to open it. I hadn't imagined that I'd be lucky enough to find the door unlocked anyways. No, I went for the window of the shack that I was able to see from my house. I knew it would be locked too, but it was one of these old wooden windows. It consisted of 2 shutters and was only held shut by a metal bolt in the center. I might be able to pry it open wide enough to loosen the bolts and open it. I pried away the 2 shutters from one another until I could fit my finger in between. At that point, I knew where the shutter was. I'd be careful. If I broke the window, the old man would hear me without a doubt. After a nerve-wracking minute of toying around with a couple of tools, I finally loosened the bolt and the window opened. I scanned the window frame from the area below. Once I saw that there was nothing I could topple over, I climbed inside. The shack was larger than I imagined. For now, all I saw were shelves filled with tools and various other things. Step by step, I made my way through the place, scanning it. And in the end, I took out a small flashlight I'd brought to give things a closer look. There was a sort of mixing station at the end of the shack. To be honest, it was nothing but an old workbench, but on it were an assortment of things. There were containers of various chemicals and fertilizers, a sack of bone meal, and a few bags of his complete fertilizer mixture. As I looked on, I noticed something next to the workbench. It was a sort of metal composter as well as a freezer cramped into the corner next to it. The composter was quite modern. It was most likely one of those that helped to quickly compost organic material. I'd read about them. My skin started to crawl as I stared at it. I took a deep breath, and after toying with it for a bit, I figured out how to open it. The instant I opened it, I almost vomited. The smell alone was enough to make me retch. When I looked inside, I saw bloody guts and a few pieces of half-rotten meat. Fucking hell, I cursed and tumbled back in shock and disgust. I crashed straight into the assortment of containers on the workbench, and a number of them clattered to the ground in an ear-shattering noise. My eyes grew wide. Fuck! You idiot, what the hell did you just do? I turned off my flashlight and waited. Oh God, please, I hoped. Please make him stay asleep. I waited for almost half a minute, praying that old Werner would stay asleep. My prayers were not answered. My heart almost stopped when I heard the front door of his house open.
God damn it, what's going on out there? If it's you damn kids again.
He said nothing else. Oh shit, did he see the window? I tried to think, tried to remember if I'd closed it after me, but I couldn't. For all I knew, the 2 window shutters might still be wide open.
Someone there?
I heard his voice, then his footsteps come closer.
I dare you. Whoever the devil you are, show yourself.
I didn't move. I hoped against all certainty that he'd go back into his house, but only a moment later, I heard him from the side of the shack.
You gotta be kidding me.
He must have seen the open window. I could already hear him rummage with the padlock. Now or never, I thought. There was no way I could explain this to him. I was back at the window. I tried to get it up, but before I could do any more than put a foot on the window frame, the door opened, and in one swift motion, he hit the light switch and saw me standing there, dressed in all black, trying to flee the scene.
What in the hell are you doing in my shack?
And then the smell hit him, and his anger turned to pure rage.
You goddamn...
But in his rage, he couldn't even finish his sentence anymore. In his blind rage, he picked up the first tool he could, a rake, and came swinging after me. There was no way I'd make it out of there in time. I barely ducked away and fled to the back of his shack. No, I didn't see anything. But I didn't get the chance to finish as I had to dodge another hit of the rake. Finally, he saw the open composter and the disturbance on the workbench.
You just had to know, didn't you? You couldn't let it be. Do you have any idea what I went through to get this? 1 decade. 1 whole decade, and now you're trying to steal it?
The hell? Had he just admitted to what I thought he had?
That's it. You're the last person to ever barge in here, I swear it.
With that, He threw the rack to the ground and came at me himself. He almost jumped me, and only now did I realize that old Warner might have been an old man, but he was damn strong. A life of farming had made his body stout and hardened his muscles. All I was able to do was struggle against him and keep him from overpowering me. I clung to sheer desperation as I was pushed back against the workbench. His eyes were wide open, and a moment later he raised one of his hands to hit me square in the face. Once. Twice. When I stumbled, he closed his hands around my neck. I couldn't breathe. Only at this moment did I realize that he was really going to kill me. I was going to die. Stars appeared in front of my eyes, but there was nothing I could do. I twitched in his iron-hard grip and grasped blindly around for something, anything. My hands closed around something hard and cold, and with all the power I could muster, I swung it into the direction of old Werner. There was a nasty sound and the old man screamed. Only when I swung it a second time did I see what I was holding on to. It was an old mallet. For a moment, I saw the surprise in his eyes and his grip loosened, only to close once more even harder. In his fury, he wasn't trying to strangle me anymore. No, he was trying to break my neck by sheer force. Again and again, I hit him with the mallet. After 3 more hits, his grip finally loosened and he slumped down and fell to the ground. As I looked down at his head, I saw a nasty inward bump at the top where I'd hit him. What I was most surprised, though, was all the blood that still kept gushing forward. Time stood still. As if in a trance, I watched the blood flow from his unmoving body. It must have been only a few seconds before I realized what I'd done, but to me it felt like an eternity. The bloody mallet clattered to the floor and I pushed old Werner's body away from me. I started shaking. Almost threw up. I'd killed him. I'd murdered someone. I had done the right thing though, hadn't I? He'd have killed me. He killed others. The guts, the meat, the freezer, there was no doubt. And I'd done it in self-defense. When I opened the freezer, my world crumbled apart. What I found inside wasn't a corpse. Neither was it body parts. It was just a dead animal. In the freezer were the remains of a deer. Part of its lower half was missing and its innards were carved out. That had been the blood and guts that I'd seen. What about the arm I'd seen last night, though? It must have been, but then I saw the legs of the deer. What I'd seen had been long, thin body part. Only the dark of the night and my imagination had transferred it into the arm of a person. Dear God, what had I done? Had this old guy really done nothing more than to create some sort of complicated organic fertilizer? Right at this moment, my instincts activated and I turned to run. I'd already made it to the door of the shack when my mind started to work again. What the hell was I doing? Should I call the police? What would I tell them? That I broke into his place because I thought he was a serial killer? That he attacked me after that and I'd killed him in self-defense? Would they ever even believe me in that outfit? No. It was much more likely that they thought I'd broke into his shack, he found me stealing stuff and I killed him. Or hell, that I came in here and killed him. I'd made it no secret that I hated him. Shit, what the fuck should I do? First I turned off the lights in the shack. Was anyone nearby? There'd been so much noise. As I watched and listened, I remembered that no one else lived near enough to have heard anything. The only person who'd heard anything would have been no one other than me. I went back inside and closed the door of the shack and then the window. I checked the wood splintering on the window and tried my best to get rid of it to make it sound as natural as possible. After that, I put everything back that the old guy had pushed off the shelves in his onslaught. And finally, there was the old guy himself. Was he really dead? I awkwardly touched his neck to see if he had any pulse. Then I looked at his head again and wondered, what the hell was I even doing? For a while, I wondered what to do, and then I saw the huge fertilizer bags. Old Werner might have been strong, but he was still scrawny and an old man. The irony was not missed on me when the old man's body was almost a perfect fit for it. I pushed the body bag to the front of the shack and then started to meticulously clean up the blood. First I wiped up the floor of the workbench. Then I checked every notch, nook, and cranny and used one of his many chemicals to get rid of any blood splatters. I checked the whole place multiple times over. I had to make sure there was no blood splatters left anywhere. Only then did I open the door again. Once again, I checked that area too. Sure, it was dark and not even 30 meters to the cornfield, yet I knew if anyone could see me carrying a bag of fertilizer through his yard the night before he went missing, I couldn't risk it. When I was sure that I was completely alone, I sprinted to the edge of the cornfield with the heavy bag over my shoulder. Once I made it, I stumbled forward a few more meters, but luckily avoided the crash to the ground. For a moment, my head was spinning, and I almost passed out from sheer exhaustion. I rested the bag between the corn stalks and then ran back to the shack. The whole place smelled of the chemicals I'd used. Once more, I went through it, using water to clear away the residue of chemicals. I also closed off the composter and the freezing box. Before I did that, though, I got part of the animal meat, cut it to pieces, and ground it up with the mallet. I added the ground up meat to the composter. I made sure to leave the bloodied and dirtied tool on the workbench, and I had to make it look as if it was the last thing the old guy had done. This moment, I noticed something else. A notebook was stashed away in a small shelf above the workbench. When I opened it, I found that it contained the old guy's notes on how to create his special type of fertilizer. It was pages upon pages of ingredients with detailed instructions. I skimmed one of the pages and it specified how certain ingredients had to be gathered. On the next one, he clarified that deer meat was best during their mating season, in autumn and early winter. That must have been the reason for his secret trips. He was getting deer meat for his fertilizer. All he'd been doing was trying to keep his formula a secret. Once I was outside again, I closed the padlock, careful not to leave any fingerprints on it. Carrying old Werner's body over to my house took quite a while. Every 10 meters or so, I had to take a break. Once I'd made it, I hid his body down in my basement. After that, I went back to the cornfield to make sure that there were no tracks or blood splatters anywhere. It was an hour or so before dawn when I was finally done with everything. I was utterly exhausted and pretty much fell into my bed. The next day was a blurry mess for me. I spent most of it in bed, curled up under my blanket. Murder is not something from which you move on with your life. You just can't. It was only that evening that I remembered his little notebook. Reading through his notes was the only thing that helped me to turn my thoughts away from what I'd done. It's not an understatement that the topic of fertilizer saved my sanity that day. I carefully went over every page. I knew damn well that I'd not be able to turn my harvest around. I might try my luck in the greenhouse though, and if that would be a success, I could prepare for next year. During the next few days, I procured quite a few things. A composter, different fertilizers, chemicals, bone meal, and a variety of other ingredients. One thing I was missing though, and that I wasn't sure how to get, was deer meat. But I knew I had a substitute for it in my basement. It was still quite fresh, and most importantly, I had to get rid of it. It was a nasty piece of work, as you can imagine. I almost vomited every couple of minutes, and due to the heat, old Werner's body had been rapidly decomposing. I almost vomited the moment I saw his bloated, squishy corpse. Eventually, though, I got used to it. I grew numb, or I was already. There's one thing, though, I told myself over and over again. This was not a person. This was a hunk of meat, nothing more. Once I cut it up, though, it became pieces. The blood, the flesh, the bones, it all became things. And that way it got easier. I didn't mind anymore. Grinding old Werner up had become nothing but work in the end. Gruesome work, sure, but still only work. It took me the better part of 2 days, but after that, I ground up the old guy's remains. Finally, I added them to the other ingredients in the composter. It was about a week or so later that the police arrived at my doorstep. I'd never seen an officer like that. Old, tired, most of all utterly disinterested in what was going on. He asked me a few questions, the typical "when have you last seen him?" and other similar ones to that. I answered them truthfully. The guy said that he'd be back if he needed more information. Checked the old guy's property, the shack, the house, and the only thing he noticed was that old Werner must have gone out in the middle of the night. It was clear that the officer didn't give a shit. He didn't care what happened here, as it was a small village. He concluded that old Werner must have just walked off and vanished in the middle of the night. He put together a search party, but it was only a few people, and they never found out a thing. Old Werner just became another name added to the list. And after this, his house was put up for sale. but no one seemed to show any interest. It's now late in the year and the fertilizer I've created has developed nicely. 6 weeks ago, I upgraded the greenhouse for winter farming, and since then, things have grown well, really well. The tomatoes are big, ripe, almost bursting with flavor. The old man had indeed created a splendid recipe. What's more interesting, though, is that I can't help but notice how fast and strong the plants have grown. They look even healthier than old Werner's. Might be unique conditions of the greenhouse, but to be honest, though, it might be due to my own addition to the fertilizer. As I'm typing this out, I can't help but laugh at the grim irony of the situation. The one way the old man was able to improve his fertilizer even further was by becoming part of it himself. Well, that was a completely messed up story. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed that. If you did, leaving a like would be great, and subbing is a great way to stay up to date when I post. Okay, so I did try to do the podcast thing on Spotify. Maybe I'm just getting older, but I do not know how to do that, so it's gonna take me a little longer to figure that one out. It's this whole issue with, you have to have like a RTMP account or something. I have no idea. It's just annoying. But they'll also just be posted here, so you can watch them here as well. Anyhow, like I said, thank you guys for watching. Leave a like if you enjoyed. Subbing is a good way to stay up to date when I post these things. I hope you guys have a good week, because this should be out hopefully Tuesday, and I will see y'all in the next one.